Sit down, Mr. Calloway. Let's not mistake one lucky line for genius.
Probably saw the problem set beforehand. Wouldn't be the first time policy handed someone a head start.
MIT, Princeton, Caltech. Let's see if the chalkboard was luck, Mr. Calloway, or if you actually belong.
Name the time.
7 years off the grid and suddenly he's untouchable? Pull every record you have. I want to know exactly what he's hiding. Explain this to the committee. A company worth billions while he's still cashing financial aid checks.
Is this accurate?
Professor Margaret Sinclair did not raise her voice. She had built an entire career on not needing to. "Mr. Calloway," she said, chalk still touching the board, "is there a reason you're staring at my work instead of copying it?" The lecture hall went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before something happens to somebody who isn't you. 211 students. 8 visiting faculty seated in the front row like a panel of judges, there to watch Sinclair teach the way other people go, to watch a controlled demolition. And in the middle of it all, in a gray hoodie that had been gray since before he bought it, a man who had not said a single word since class started. He said one now. "There's an error in line 3. A pen stopped clicking somewhere to his left." Somebody's laptop fan seemed suddenly very loud. Sinclair turned from the board with the unhurried precision of a woman who had never once in her career been wrong in front of a room, and did not plan to start today. Silver-rimmed glasses, posture like a held note. She looked at the student who had spoken, mid-20s, hood up over close-cropped hair, a spiral notebook in front of him with nothing written on it yet, and something in her face settled into the particular calm of a predator that has just located its meal. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am." In the front row, Professor Gregory Hale leaned toward the colleague next to him and didn't bother lowering his voice all the way. "I heard he got in on one of those access programs. Watch this." A few soft laughs. Nobody hid them. Isaiah Calloway had heard worse in rooms with better acoustics. He kept his eyes on the board. Sinclair set the chalk down with a small, deliberate click. "Then come show me." He stood. He did not look around the room to see who was watching, because he already knew. He walked to the front in the unbothered, unhurried way of a man who had once stood in front of a room of venture capital partners and told them their term sheet was insulting, and lived. 20 feet of lecture hall carpet had never once made him nervous in his life. He took the chalk from her hand. He erased nothing. He simply circled the error, a sign flipped in a transformation step, small enough that a tired grader might have missed it for a semester, and rewrote the line correctly beneath it, in handwriting so even it looked typed. He set the chalk in the tray. The click was very loud. Sinclair studied the board for 4 full seconds, looking for a reason to say he was wrong. There wasn't one. There never was with him, and that fact bothered her more than any actual mistake would have. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway." He sat. She did not say good job. She did not say thank you. She picked the chalk back up and kept teaching as if nothing had happened, which was its own kind of message, and everyone in that room knew exactly what the message was. Hargrove University sat on 60 acres of red Georgia clay on the west side of Atlanta, close enough to Auburn Avenue that you could walk it on a lunch break if your shoes were good. It liked to call itself a feeder school for Wall Street quants and Silicon Valley engineers, and for the most part it had earned the reputation honestly. Sinclair's advanced real analysis sequence was the filter. Everybody knew it. The students who survived it got recruiter calls. The students who didn't got a kind note from their advisor about alternative paths, which was academic, for "we're done with you." What almost nobody in that lecture hall knew, what Isaiah Calloway had spent considerable, deliberate effort making sure nobody knew, was that he had sat in this exact building 7 years earlier, in a chair 3 rows back, as a 20-year-old on full need-based aid who could not afford the textbook and read it standing in the bookstore aisle instead. He had been 1 course short of his degree when he left. He had told himself at the time that he would come back the following semester. The following semester had turned into 7 years, a company, and more money than he had ever let himself think about in concrete numbers, because concrete numbers had a way of making a person forget who raised them. He was not here to be recognized. He was here to finish 1 transcript line that had sat for 7 years as an incomplete that had quietly, administratively, become an F once the clock on it ran out. Hargrove's policy was unambiguous. The degree he had otherwise completed in full would not be conferred until that single course was retaken and passed. One semester, one professor, one grade. He had not expected the professor to be Margaret Sinclair, who had not been teaching this section 7 years ago, and who, as far as he could tell, had never once in her life let a single thing go unanswered. He had also not expected to enjoy it, a little, in the specific way you enjoy something that used to scare you and no longer can. At the end of class, as 200 students packed bags and Sinclair erased the board in long, efficient strokes, a hand caught Isaiah's shoulder in the aisle. "Bro." Andre Boykin had a backpack with one strap and the particular energy of a third year who had not slept properly since declaring his major. "Bro, you just casually fixed Sinclair's board like it was a typo in a group chat." "It was a typo. It is never just a typo with her. You know that, right? You know what you just did? I corrected a sign error." "You corrected a sign error in front of 8 visiting professors who came here specifically to watch her destroy people. And now she knows your name." Andre slung the one-strap bag higher. "I give it a week before she finds a way to make you regret being right. She's not wrong that often. It won't come up much." "That's not the flex you think it is, man." They walked out into a March afternoon thick with the smell of cut grass and somebody's food truck 2 blocks over. Isaiah's car was where he always parked it, in the cheap lot behind the engineering building, a 12-year-old sedan with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light he had decided, with some affection, to simply ignore. He paid for his coffee in cash most mornings, out of an old habit he had never quite let go of. A habit from a version of himself that had once needed to watch every dollar leave his hand. Andre had never asked why a grown man drove a car like that. Andre had also never asked a lot of things, which was one of the reasons Isaiah liked him. "You coming to the thing Friday?" Andre asked. "What thing?" "There's always a thing, Calloway. Come to the thing. I have somewhere to be Friday." "You always have somewhere to be. You're the only 27-year-old undergrad I know who acts like he's got a board meeting at 6 a.m. Isaiah did not answer that one. He got in his car. Where he had somewhere to be every Friday without exception was 40 minutes east, in a kitchen on Auburn Avenue that smelled like bacon grease and pound cake, no matter what time of day you walked in. Isaiah Calloway had lived in that house since before Isaiah was born, in a neighborhood that had been black-owned and black-built since before her own mother was born, 3 blocks from where a different grandson, a long time ago, had grown up to change the whole country. She did not bring that up often. She had her own grandson to worry about. She had worked in Hargrove's main dining hall for 31 years. Tray line, then prep then, for the last decade, the steam table, where the football players and the engineering majors and the visiting parents all came through and called her Miss Odessa, whether they knew her name or not, because she had a face that made people want to know it. She had never finished high school. She had left in the 11th grade to work, the way a lot of women her age in that neighborhood had, and had gotten her GED at 34 in a night class she never told anyone she was nervous about, and had raised her daughter's son from the time he was 8 years old without once asking anybody for anything she could find a way to do herself. "You eat lunch today," she said the second he came through the door, not a question. "I ate, what, a protein bar. Boy, it had 18 grams of protein, Grandma. It had 18 grams of cardboard. Sit down." He sat down. She put a plate in front of him without asking if he wanted one, because in 31 years of feeding people for a living, she had never once met a man who didn't want one. And he ate it, because some things you didn't fight even when you were worth more money than the building they were sitting in. "How's the class?" she said. "Fine." That's what you said last week, too." "It's fine, Grandma. I'm handling it. You handling it or you handling it?" She gave him a look she had been giving him since he was 8, the one that could find a lie 3 rooms away. "Because those are 2 different things, baby. And I have been watching you do both my whole life." Isaiah set his fork down. He thought about telling her about Sinclair. He thought about telling her that a professor who didn't know his last name from a stranger's had already looked at him like a problem to be solved. He decided against it, the way he always decided against worrying her with things he could carry himself, which was its own old habit. One she had taught him without meaning to, by carrying so much herself for so long that he had grown up believing that was simply what love looked like in practice. "I'm handling it," he said again, and this time she let it go, because she had her own way of knowing when a thing wasn't finished, and she had decided a long time ago that some battles you let your grandson fight in his own time. What she did not know, what he had still, after 7 years, never quite found the words to tell her plainly, was the precise size of the company he had built instead of finishing this degree. She knew there was a company. She knew it did something with numbers and computers that she did not pretend to understand and did not need to. She knew it paid for the roof 2 years ago, and the hip surgery the year before that, and the fact that she had not had to pick up an extra shift in longer than she'd admit. She believed in the comfortable, half-examined way people believe things about family they love and don't interrogate, that her grandson did well for himself. She did not know that Variance Capital Management, the quantitative trading fund Isaiah had built out of a dorm room model 7 years ago, and grown into one of the most consistently profitable funds of its size on the East Coast, had made him, on paper, somewhere north of $900 million, a number that moved by tens of millions some weeks, depending on volatility he had once found thrilling and now mostly found exhausting. He had never told her the number. He had told himself, for years, that this was protecting her. He was starting to suspect it was something closer to protecting himself, from the version of this conversation where money changed the way she looked at him. Even a little, even for a second. He drove back to his apartment that night thinking about Sinclair's face when she'd found nothing wrong with his correction. He had seen that exact look on a hedge fund manager once, the moment the man realized the kid across the table actually understood the risk model better than he did. It was not anger. It was the much colder thing that comes right before anger. When a person realizes the floor they've been standing on their whole career might not be where they thought it was. He did not think much more about it. He should have. 3 days later, Sinclair opened class by handing him a textbook open to a problem. From the back third of the chapter, the kind professors assigned to graduate students who'd already failed the section once. "If you're so confident, Mr. Calloway." She set it on his desk without looking at him. "Solve it at the board now." The room came alive the way a room comes alive when it smells a fight starting. Hale, 3 seats down from the visiting faculty section, did not bother to hide his smile this time. "This ought to be good," he murmured, loud enough to be heard. Isaiah picked up the book. He read the problem once. He walked to the board. He solved it in 4 minutes, without a single line crossed out, in the same even handwriting as before, and set the chalk down with the same small, deliberate click. The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier. A girl in the 3rd row actually said out loud, "What the hell?" before she could stop herself. Sinclair did not smile. She did not frown. She looked at the board for a long moment, the way a person looks at a bill they're hoping has an error in their favor. And then she looked at him, and something shifted behind her eyes that he recognized from a different kind of room entirely, the look of someone recalculating, in real time, exactly how dangerous he might be. "Sit down," she said. Then, after a pause just long enough to matter, "We'll see how you do with real pressure." He sat. He did not know yet what real pressure meant to a woman like Margaret Sinclair, or how far she was willing to reach to manufacture it. He found out on Friday. She waited until the end of class, until backpacks were already half-zipped, and then she set down her marker and said, to the whole room, in a voice that carried without rising at all, "There's a National Collegiate Mathematics Invitational in 3 weeks, 8 schools, MIT, Caltech, Princeton, ourselves among them. It draws the best graduate track minds in the country." She let that sit. "Mr. Calloway clearly believes he belongs in rooms like that one. I'd like to see if he's right, in front of people whose opinions actually matter." A ripple went through the hall. Somebody laughed, sharp and disbelieving. Hale leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man watching a trap close exactly on schedule. "She's serious," someone whispered. "She's actually challenging him." Isaiah felt every eye in the room land on him at once, the way they had in board meetings, in pitch rooms, in the one VC office where a partner had asked him, not unkindly, whether he was sure he was old enough to be raising this kind of money. He had learned a long time ago what to do with a room like that. You let the silence sit exactly as long as it needs to, and you answer like it was never actually a question. All right, he said, I'll do it. No hesitation, no performance. Just the flat, settled tone of a man accepting terms he had already priced. Sinclair's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A flicker so brief most of the room missed it entirely. The first half-second of a person realizing they may have just made a mistake they can't yet name. Isaiah didn't miss it. He filed it away the way he filed away everything, and gathered his things and walked out into the late afternoon without looking back. Gregory Hale did not walk out with the rest of the room. He waited until the hallway had mostly cleared, until Sinclair had gone back into her office and shut the door. And then he stepped into an alcove by the stairwell, took out his phone, and dialed a number he had used exactly twice before, both times for students he'd been certain had cheated their way into grades they hadn't earned. It rang twice. Registrar's office, this is Pam. Pam, it's Gregory Hale, math department. I'm on the academic standards committee this term. I need you to pull a student file for me. Full enrollment history, not just current term. He glanced once down the empty hallway. Calloway. Isaiah Calloway. There was a pause on the other end, the small administrative shuffle of someone reaching for a keyboard. Spell the last name? He spelled it. He did not yet know what he was looking for. He only knew with the absolute conviction of a man who has never once in his career been forced to examine that conviction, that a sign error and a back-of-the-book problem were not the kind of thing an ordinary student walked through without trembling, and that somewhere in this young man's file there had to be a reason. There always was, in his experience. He just hadn't found this one yet. Sinclair's packet arrived in his university email at 6 the next morning. No note, no subject line beyond a course code. 41 problems. The kind that showed up in qualifying exams for math PhD programs. The kind designed less to test whether you knew the material than to see how long it took you to stop believing you did. Andre found him in the library that Saturday at a table buried in scratch paper, 11 hours in, a coffee gone cold at his elbow. You've been here since when? 8. It's 7, man. At night. I'm aware. Andre dropped into the chair across from him and watched for a minute, the particular silence of someone trying to figure out whether to say something or let it go. Isaiah's pen didn't stop moving. Can I ask you something? Andre said finally. And you not get weird about it? Depends what it is. You drive a car that should legally be condemned. You ate a protein bar for lunch yesterday, like it was a personality trait. And you just spent 11 straight hours on extra credit math nobody's making you do. On a Saturday, like your life depends on it. Andre leaned forward. Are you secretly rich or something? Is this a bit? Isaiah's pen stopped for exactly one beat too long. No, he said, and went back to writing. It came out flatter than he meant it to, and sharper, the kind of no that answers a question by closing a door instead of opening one. And Andre, who was many things but not unobservant, caught it, filed it away with a small frown, and let it go, because some things you didn't push a friend on even when your instincts told you to. The truth was that Isaiah had not always lived like this. There had been a year, briefly, after the second funding round closed, when he'd let himself believe money was supposed to change how a room felt around him, and he had bought a car that cost more than his grandmother's house and worn it like armor for exactly 4 months before he understood, with a kind of quiet horror, that he didn't recognize the man driving it. He'd sold the car. He'd gone back to the version of himself that paid cash out of habit and ate badly when he was working and didn't tell people things, because that version, whatever its flaws, was at least the one Isaiah Calloway had actually raised. He worked until the library closed. He kept working at home until the numbers blurred, and somewhere in the small hours, the way it always happened when he pushed himself past the point of strategy and into something closer to instinct, his mind drifted backward to the last time he'd sat in a room like Sinclair's and tried to solve a problem that mattered. He had been 20 years old, 3 years into Hargrove on a full-ride need-based scholarship called the Hargrove Promise, the kind of program universities built press releases around, the kind that paid for everything down to the lab fees for kids whose families couldn't have covered a single semester otherwise. He'd been one course from finishing 2 years early. already running a small trading model out of his dorm room that he'd built mostly to keep his mind occupied between problem sets. When Odessa had collapsed in the Hargrove dining hall on a Tuesday in October, mid-shift, in front of 40 students eating lunch, a stroke. Mild, the doctors said, as if there were a version of your grandmother's brain briefly losing its blood supply that qualified as mild. She'd recovered most of her speech within days. She had not, however, been able to work for 4 months, and her insurance had not been able to cover what 4 months without income actually cost a woman with no savings and a mortgage on a house on Auburn Avenue that had been in the family since before fair housing law existed. He'd had $11,000 in a brokerage account from the trading model, which had just, 2 weeks earlier, attracted the interest of a small Atlanta-based investment group looking to seed exactly the kind of strategy he'd built. He had a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Take the seed money, drop the one class he had left, and go make enough to keep his grandmother's lights on and her medication paid for, or stay enrolled and watch her lose the house she'd raised him in. He had not hesitated. People who say money isn't everything have usually never had to watch someone they love choose between insulin and rent. He had told himself, packing up his dorm room that October, that he would come back the following spring and finish one class. He had meant it completely. He had also had no idea, at 20, what it actually took to build something from $11,000 into a fund that could support a household, how many 18-hour days it would swallow, how many springs would come and go while he was still building, how 7 years could pass the way. 7 years pass when you are too busy surviving to notice you've stopped being a student and started being something else entirely. He had never stopped intending to come back. He had simply, somewhere in year 4, stopped believing the timeline mattered to anyone but him. It had mattered to Odessa more than he understood. She had never asked him to finish. That was the thing he came back to, lying awake at 3 in the morning with 41 unsolved problems still on the table. She had never once in 7 years said the word degree to him like a debt he owed her. What she had done every single year on the anniversary of the stroke was say the same 6 words at dinner, looking at him for a plate of something she'd made too much of on purpose, the way she always made too much of everything. You still got that class, baby? Not a question. A small, patient flag planted in the ground, year after year, by a woman who had left school in the 11th grade to go to work, and had spent 34 years believing, privately and without ever quite saying it out loud, that the one door she'd never been able to walk all the way through herself was the most important door in the world to leave open behind her grandson. She had told him once, when he was 12 and struggling with long division and ready to throw the workbook across the kitchen, about 3 women he'd never heard of: Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, who had done the trajectory math for the first American in orbit by hand, with slide rules, in a building where they weren't allowed to use the same bathroom as the engineers they were correcting. They didn't get a hoodie and a quiet seat in the back, baby, she'd said. They had a sign on the door, finish the workbook. He had finished the workbook. He had never forgotten the names. He finished the 41 problems by 4 in the morning, every one of them correct, and slept 3 hours, and was in his seat in Sinclair's lecture hall the next afternoon like nothing had happened, because that was the only answer he knew how to give a test like that. Sinclair collected nothing. She did not ask how he'd done. She simply watched him walk in, watched him sit down, and filed her own conclusion away with the same flat, unreadable expression she'd worn since the day he corrected her board, and said nothing about it at all, which was somehow worse than if she had. The summons came 4 days later on university letterhead, requesting his presence in the office of Dr. Patricia Renner, Dean of Student Conduct, at his earliest convenience. He went that afternoon. Dean Renner's office was small and orderly, the kind of room that belonged to someone who had spent a career trying to be fair inside a system that did not always make fairness easy. She was in her late 50s, reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair, a folder already open on the desk in front of her when he sat down. Mr. Calloway, thank you for coming in. She did not waste time on pleasantries, which he respected even as his stomach went tight. A formal complaint was filed with this office on Tuesday, alleging a violation of the academic honesty policy. Specifically, that you obtained unauthorized assistance, materials, or outside collaboration in completing coursework in Professor Sinclair's advanced real analysis sequence. The room went very still around him, the particular stillness of hearing a sentence land that you know is about to change the shape of the next several weeks of your life. Who filed it? I'm not obligated to share that at this stage, though it will become part of the record during the hearing process. She slid the folder an inch across the desk, not yet turning it to face him. I'll tell you plainly what the complaint cites, because you deserve to understand what you're responding to. It cites your enrollment history. You entered Hargrove on full need-based aid through the Promise program 7 years ago, withdrew abruptly in your final semester with passing but unremarkable marks, and have now returned, in a single term, performing at a level the complainant describes as, she glanced down, inconsistent with any reasonable academic trajectory, suggesting external assistance or compromised assessment integrity. Isaiah sat very still. That's it, he said. That's the whole case. I got better at math. I'm not the one deciding the merits, Mr. Calloway. I'm the one required to follow the process once a complaint is filed by a faculty member in good standing. Her voice softened, very slightly, in a way that told him she'd had this exact conversation with other students before and hadn't liked it any of those times either. What I am required to tell you is this. Pending the outcome of the investigation, university policy automatically suspends any student under formal review from representing the institution in competitive or honorary capacities. That includes the national invitational Professor Sinclair entered you into. The hearing is scheduled for 5 days from today. The invitational is in 9 days. So even if I'm cleared, if you're cleared before the hearing concludes, the suspension lifts. Not before. She closed the folder. I'd encourage you to take this seriously. I'd also encourage you, if there's anything in your history that explains the gap that isn't on this page, to find a way to bring it forward. Committees believe documents. They believe people a little less, unfortunately, but they do still listen. He left her office and stood in the hallway for a long moment, the kind of stillness that has nothing peaceful in it at all. 9 days, 1 class. One promise made at a kitchen table on Auburn Avenue, year after year, by a woman who had never once asked him for anything else in his entire life. He did not yet know exactly what Gregory Hale had pulled from his file beyond the bare facts Dean Renner had read aloud, or how much further the man intended to dig before the hearing, or what he would find if he kept going. He was about to find out exactly how far Hale was willing to reach, and he was about to learn it in the worst possible room, in front of the worst possible audience, with 9 days narrowing toward a deadline that did not care, even a little, how good he was at math. He drove to Auburn Avenue that night, the way he drove there every night that mattered, without quite deciding to. Odessa was at the stove when he came in, humming something low and tuneless that he'd known his whole life and never once asked the name of, a pot of something simmering that smelled like onions and bay leaf and Tuesday. She didn't turn around. You're quiet, she said. You're never quiet unless something's wrong. Long day. She stirred the pot. You gonna tell me, or you gonna make me guess? Because I will guess, baby. And I will guess something worse than whatever it actually is. He stood in the doorway for a second, watching her shoulders, the same shoulders that had carried trays for 31 years and carried him for 27. And he thought about the folder on Dean Renner's desk, and the word unauthorized, and how close that word was, without either of them knowing it, to the actual shape of the secret he'd been keeping from her. It's nothing I can't handle, he said. Just some paperwork with the class. I'll sort it before the competition. She turned around then, just enough to look at him over her shoulder. And for a moment he thought she might press it, the way she'd pressed everything else his whole life, refusing to let him carry things alone that she could carry instead. She didn't. 9 more days till that competition? 9. Then you got 9 days to sort your paperwork. She turned back to the stove. Sit down. Eat something that isn't cardboard. He sat down. He ate. He did not tell her that the paperwork had her name in it too, in everything but ink. that whatever Gregory Hale thought he had found it by pulling on the one thread that led eventually all the way back to a stroke in a dining hall and an account with $11,000 in it and a promise made at this exact table, in this exact kitchen, year after year, without either of them ever once calling it a debt. He had 9 days. He had no idea yet that Gregory Hale had already stopped looking at his transcript and started looking somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that had nothing to do with mathematics at all. The hearing room on the 3rd floor of the administration building had a long table, 8 chairs, and the particular fluorescent light that makes everyone in it look slightly guilty of something. Dean Renner sat at the head of it. 3 faculty members from the Academic Standards Committee sat along one side. Margaret Sinclair sat at the far end, posture immaculate, a single legal pad in front of her with nothing written on it. Gregory Hale sat closest to the door. A folder 3 inches thick stacked beside his elbow like a trophy he was waiting for permission to display. Isaiah sat alone on the other side, with Andre 2 seats back against the wall, because Andre had refused, flatly, to let him walk in there without at least one person in the room who knew his name for reasons that had nothing to do with a complaint form. "This committee is convened," Dean Renner said, "to consider a formal allegation of academic dishonesty against Mr. Isaiah Calloway. Professor Hale, you brought the complaint. The floor is yours." Hale stood. He buttoned his jacket the way men do when they believe the next several minutes are going to be remembered. "Thank you, Dean Renner." He opened the folder. 7 years ago, Mr. Calloway entered Hargrove on full need-based aid through the Promise Scholarship Program. His transcript from that period shows solid, unremarkable performance, competent, never exceptional. In his final semester, with 1 course remaining, he withdrew without explanation and did not return for 7 years. He let that sit a moment, the way a man does when he believes a pause is doing work for him. This term, Mr. Calloway re-enrolled to complete that single course. In a matter of weeks, he has solved problems on site that graduate students require hours to approach. He corrected a tenured professor's work in front of visiting faculty. He completed a 41-problem qualifying exam-level packet, unassisted by his own account, in under 20 hours with 0 errors. Hale looked up. "I want to be direct with this committee. I do not believe a 7-year gap explains this. I believe Mr. Calloway has had access to resources, tutoring, materials, outside collaboration, that he has not disclosed, and that this committee has an obligation to find out what they are before this institution puts its name behind a degree it cannot vouch for." Dean Renner turned to Isaiah. "Mr. Calloway, you may respond." Isaiah stood. 7 years is a long time," he said. "I haven't stopped doing mathematics in that time. I've used it every day, in a field where being wrong costs real money fast enough that you learn not to be wrong twice." He kept his voice level, unhurried, the same register he'd have used pricing risk in front of a room of partners. "If the committee doubts I can do this work myself, I'm happy to demonstrate it right now, on a problem of the committee's choosing, with no preparation." One of the standards committee members, a quiet statistic professor named Dr. Okonkwo, who had said nothing so far, leaned forward. "I'll take you up on that." She wrote a problem on a legal pad, a nasty multivariable optimization with a constraint that doubled back on itself, and slid it across the table. Isaiah solved it in under 3 minutes, narrating each step out loud as he went, the way he'd once narrated a risk model to a roomful of skeptical investors who'd needed to hear his thinking, not just see his answer. When he finished, Dr. Okonkwo looked at the page for a long moment and then looked at Hale. "That answers the question of whether he can do the mathematics," she said. "I don't think anyone in this room can argue otherwise after watching that." For 1 second, Isaiah let himself believe it might actually be that simple. It was not. Hale's jaw tightened, but he did not sit down. "With respect, Dr. Okonkwo, demonstrating ability in this room today does not explain how he obtained that ability after a 7-year absence with no record of formal study. And there is a second matter this committee should be aware of." He reached into the folder and pulled out a single printed page. "I ran a standard background search as part of due diligence on this complaint, as is my right as the filing party." He set the page in the center of the table and turned it to face Dean Renner. "This is a Delaware corporate filing, publicly available through the SEC's Investment Advisor Registry. It lists an Isaiah M. Calloway as the founder and managing member of Variance Capital Management, LLC, a registered investment fund. Public filings put assets under management for that fund in the billions of dollars. The room went silent in a way it had not gone silent yet that day. I would ask this committee, Hale continued, and his voice had changed now, something closer to triumph underneath the procedural calm, whether a man with access to that kind of wealth and infrastructure, analysts, modeling, software, an entire firm's worth of quantitative talent at his disposal, required 7 years and a need-based scholarship from this institution at all. Whether the original aid application is even valid, and whether his return to this campus, under these circumstances, in a hooded sweatshirt, sitting quietly while this institution feeds and houses him as though he needs it, is anything other than a calculated insult to every student in this program who actually does. Andre, against the wall, said, "Wait, what?" loud enough for 3 people to turn around. Sinclair did not speak. She had gone very still at the words Variance Capital, her pen motionless above the legal pad, and when Dean Renner glanced down the table at her, expecting the instructor of record to weigh in, to say something in either direction, Margaret Sinclair simply folded her hands and said nothing at all, which everyone in that room correctly understood as exactly the answer it was. She had wondered, in some unexamined corner of her mind since the first correction on her board, whether something about him didn't add up. She had been telling herself it was instinct. It had simply been waiting for a folder to confirm it. Dean Renner picked up the filing, read it twice, and set it down with the particular care of someone holding something that had just gotten much heavier. Mr. Calloway. Is this accurate? Every eye in the room turned to him. He could have ended it there. He understood that, sitting in the silence, more clearly than he had understood anything in the 7 years since he'd walked out of a dorm room with $11,000 and a promise to come back. One sentence. Yes, and here is exactly when the money started, and exactly when the aid stopped, and the dates do not overlap by a single day, and the fraud theory collapsed under its own timeline before anyone in the room finished reading it, but it would not stay one sentence. He knew that, too. The moment those words left his mouth in this room, in front of a folder that already had his name in it, for the wrong reasons, the story would not be a finished gap in a transcript anymore. It would be a billionaire who slummed it for a semester for the optics. It would be a headline before sundown. It would turn the one private, unpublicized promise he had left in the world into a press cycle, and it would do it on a day he had not chosen, in a room built by a man who had decided, before any of this started, that the only explanation for a poor kid getting smart was that he must not have been poor to begin with. He was not ready to hand Gregory Hale that win, not yet. Not on Hale's terms. "I'm not prepared to discuss my financial history in this setting today," he said instead, evenly. "I'll say only that whatever is in that filing has nothing to do with how I completed that problem set, or this morning's problem. The math speaks for itself." It was the truth. It was also, he understood the moment he said it, not nearly enough. Dean Renner closed the folder slowly. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be fair to you, and I want you to hear that clearly. But this committee cannot simply set aside a documented, verifiable connection to significant undisclosed wealth on the basis that you'd rather not discuss it. Given the severity of what's been presented, I'm extending the suspension pending a full audit of your original financial aid application, in addition to the academic integrity review. That audit will take time this committee does not control. The National Invitational is in 4 days. I'm sorry. You will not be representing this institution in that competition while this is unresolved." 4 days, Isaiah said. "I'm sorry," Dean Renner said again, and she sounded like she meant it, which somehow made it worse. The hearing ended a few minutes later in the particular quiet that follows a verdict. Nobody in the room is fully comfortable with. Sinclair gathered her legal pad, still blank, and left without a word to anyone. Hale closed his folder with the satisfied economy of a man who believed he had done something righteous. Andre caught up with Isaiah in the stairwell, 2 steps behind, breathing hard. "Is it true?" Andre's voice had an edge in it Isaiah had never heard from him before, something between hurt and confusion. "The billions thing, is any of that real?" Isaiah stopped on the landing. "Yeah," he said. Andre stood there for a second, processing. his face doing several things at once. Disbelief, a flash of something that looked almost like betrayal, the particular sting of realizing a friend has been a different size than you understood the whole time you knew them. Man, I asked you straight up in the library if you were secretly rich. You looked me in my face and said no. I know. That's it. Okay. That's a lot, Calloway. That's genuinely a lot to find out in a stairwell. I know that too. Andre exhaled, long, and some of the heat went out of his shoulders, because whatever else was true, the version of Isaiah standing in front of him right now looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in 9 days. Okay. Look, I'm mad a little. I'm gonna stay mad for like a day. But you've got 4 days and a suspension and a grandmother who doesn't know any of this is happening. So can we be mad later and figure out the part where you're about to lose everything you actually came back here for? It was, Isaiah thought, exactly the right thing for a real friend to say, and exactly the wrong moment to feel relieved by anything. He drove to Auburn Avenue that night without calling first. Odessa was on the porch when he pulled up, the way she sometimes was on warm evenings, a glass of sweet tea sweating on the rail beside her. She took one look at his face in the porch light and didn't ask if something was wrong. She just moved her feet off the second chair and waited for him to sit down and start talking, the way she had waited out every hard thing he had ever brought to that porch since he was 8 years old. He told her all of it. He told her about the $11,000 in the dorm room and the stroke and the choice that had never felt like a choice. He told her the number, the real number, out loud for the first time in 7 years, and watched her face do something complicated and quiet that wasn't shock so much as a kind of grief for time she hadn't known was being spent that way. He told her about Hale and the filing and the 4 days and the suspension and the word fraud sitting in a folder that had nothing true in it except the dates, which were the one thing that actually cleared him if anyone in that room had been willing to ask for them, instead of assuming the worst from a scholarship file. Odessa was quiet for a long time after he finished. All this time, she said finally, I thought I was the one who didn't have nothing to give you back. Turns out you've been carrying something this whole time too heavy to set down at my table. I didn't want it to change how you saw me. Baby. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, the same hand that had pulled trays for 31 years, steady as anything. Money never changed how I see you a day in your life. I watched you eat cereal for dinner so you could send half your paycheck home before you had a paycheck big enough to call it that. I know exactly who raised you. A number on a piece of paper doesn't get to undo that just because you finally said it out loud. He didn't answer right away. What do I do? He said finally. If I tell them the truth, it's not a quiet thing anymore. It's not just for you and me. Odessa looked out at the street for a moment, at the porches lit up one after another down Auburn Avenue, at a neighborhood that had spent 100 years being underestimated by people who never once bothered to walk down it and look. Baby, you've been letting a folder decide who gets to know you for 9 days now, she said. Maybe it's time you decide that instead. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. He sat on that porch until almost midnight, the suspension still in effect. The competition 4 days out and now, with travel and credentialing, functionally already lost unless something changed before morning, and a single page of a financial filing sitting in a folder in an administration building, waiting to mean whatever the next person who opened it decided it meant. He was, for the first time in 7 years, completely out of moves that didn't require telling the truth. He picked up his phone a little after midnight and called Dean Renner's office voicemail because he had made his decision, and decisions made at midnight on a porch on Auburn Avenue had a way of staying made by morning. Dean Renner, he said after the tone, it's Isaiah Calloway. I'd like to request an emergency session of the committee before the invitational, whenever your schedule allows it. I have something I should have brought you 9 days ago. I'm done not saying it. He hung up. Her assistant called back 2 mornings later. The earliest the full committee could reconvene, with everyone's calendars what they were, was 7 a.m. on the morning of the invitational itself, which meant, if the committee ruled against him, there would be no invitational left to rule him back into at all. He had no idea, yet, whether one folder full of dates would be enough to fix what Gregory Hale had spent 9 days building. with no margin left for anything to go wrong. He was about to find out. The emergency session convened at 7 that morning, the same morning as the invitational. Before most of campus had finished its first coffee, Dean Renner sat at the head of the table again. Dr. Okonkwo was there. Sinclair was there, in the same immaculate posture, the same blank legal pad. Hale arrived 4 minutes late, visibly thrown by the early hour, his folder noticeably thinner than before, as though he sensed without being told that the ground under it had shifted in the night. Isaiah did not bring a lawyer. He brought a single printed page, and Odessa, who had insisted on coming and had not been talked out of it, and who sat in the back row in her good church coat, with her hands folded the way she'd folded them at every important thing in his life. "Dean Renner," he said, standing. "9 days ago you told me that committees believe documents better than they believe people, but that they still listen. I'm going to give you both." He set the page on the table and turned it to face her. "This is Variance Capital Management's formation filing with the Delaware Secretary of State. The date is right there at the top. I started that company 14 months after the last disbursement of my Hargrove Promise Aid hit my account. 14 months after I withdrew from this university with one course left to take care of my grandmother after a stroke nearly took her from me in your dining hall. There is no month, no week, no single day where my financial aid and that company's existence overlap. Whatever Professor Hale believes he found, the dates disprove it completely, and they have the whole time." Hale opened his mouth. Dean Renner raised one hand, just slightly, and he closed it again. "I didn't tell this committee that 9 days ago because the moment I did, this stopped being about whether I cheated and became about something else entirely. A story, a headline, a billionaire playing dress-up in a classroom for sympathy. That is not what this was. I came back because I made a promise to the woman sitting in the back of this room, the same promise I made her every year for 7 years without ever quite finding the courage to say it loud enough, that I would finish what I started, not because I needed the degree, but because she has spent 31 years of her life on this campus, feeding people who will never know her name, and the one thing she ever asked me for was to finish the workbook." His voice didn't break exactly, but it came close, and he let it. "There's an organization called the National Association of Mathematicians. A group of black mathematicians started it in 1969 because the major professional societies in this field somehow never had more than a handful of them in any given room, year after year, decade after decade. I think about that a lot. I thought about it the first day I sat in this professor's lecture hall and heard a colleague of hers guess out loud that I'd gotten in through some kind of access program before I'd said a single word. I came back to finish one class. I did not come back to prove anything to anyone in this room. But I'm not going to apologize for being good at this, and I am not going to let a folder decide what that goodness means." The room was silent for a long moment. Dean Renner looked at the filing date. She looked at her own notes from the first hearing. She looked finally at Hale. "Professor Hale, the dates on this document predate your complaint and were available to you the moment you pulled the same background search you used to build your case. Did you check them before bringing a fraud allegation to this committee?" Hale's jaw worked once before he answered. The timeline wasn't the central issue. The issue was disclosure and the unusual. The issue, as you presented it to this committee yesterday, was that Mr. Calloway defrauded a need-based aid program," Dean Renner said, her voice flat and final in a way it had not been the day before. "That allegation is now disproven by the same public record you cited to make it. This committee is dismissing the complaint, lift a suspension's effective immediately, and clearing Mr. Calloway's record in full." She closed the folder in front of her with a sound that landed like a verdict, because it was one. "Professor Hale, you and I will be discussing separately the scope of your access to student records in pursuing this complaint, and whether that access exceeded what your committee role authorizes. I'd encourage you to have an explanation ready." Margaret Sinclair had not said a word through any of it. She sat at the far end of the table with her blank legal pad and watched a man she had quietly, privately, allowed herself to believe alongside, 2 days earlier, get taken apart by a single sheet of paper he could have checked himself. And something in her face, not quite shame, not yet, but adjacent to it, settled in and did not leave for the rest of the meeting. Isaiah was airborne 90 minutes later. On a flight, he chartered himself for the first time in his life without 1 second of guilt about it, and landed in Washington with just enough time to walk into the Invitational's final round with his credential reinstated and the ink barely dry on the order that made it so. A final problem put in front of him, and a third-year MIT PhD candidate named Connor Wren was the kind designed to separate the merely excellent from whatever came after excellent. Wren wrote fast, confident, the practiced hand of someone who had been groomed for rooms like this one since high school. Isaiah wrote the way he traded, not fast for its own sake, but exactly as fast as the problem allowed and not one beat faster, because panic was where mistakes lived, and he had given up panic a long time ago, somewhere around the third sleepless month of building a company out of $11,000 and a promise. He set his pen down first. 2 judges crossed the room to check his work, the way judges had checked it for 9 days now, looking for the error that would make all of this make sense again. They did not find one. A professor from Princeton, reading over his shoulder, said quietly, to no one in particular, he didn't just solve it. He found a cleaner path through it than the answer key has. The announcement, when it came, did not surprise the room nearly as much as it should have, because by then the room had already started to understand what kind of morning this was. Word of the hearing reached Hargrove before Isaiah's flight back did. The way these things always travel faster than the people they're about. A clerk who'd heard the dismissal read aloud. A committee member who couldn't quite keep it to herself. A single screenshot of a Delaware filing that made its way into 3 group chats before lunch. By the time Isaiah walked back into the same lecture hall 2 days later, for what should have been an ordinary Thursday class, 211 students already knew exactly who had been sitting in the back row in a gray hoodie for the last several weeks, and what he was actually worth, and what he had chosen to spend 9 of the hardest days of his adult life defending instead of simply announcing. Dean Renner was waiting at the front of the room when he walked in, which was not ordinary at all. Mr. Calloway, if you have a moment, the department would like a word, formally. In front of the class, you've been part of this term. She glanced at Sinclair, seated stiffly in the front row for once, instead of standing at the board. Professor Sinclair has something she'd like to say as well. Sinclair stood. It took her a visible effort, the kind of effort a woman who had never once apologized in a classroom in 30 years finds for exactly 1 moment in her career, if she's lucky and recognizes it while it's happening. In the last week, she said, this committee has heard, separately and unprompted, from 4 former students of mine, spanning 8 years, describing a pattern of treatment in my classroom that I would have called rigor and that I am now required to call something closer to its real name. She did not look at Isaiah. She looked at the room. I built a reputation on the idea that doubt was a teaching tool. I want to be honest, in front of all of you, that I aimed that doubt more often and more sharply at students who looked like Mr. Calloway, and I told myself for a long time that this was standards. It was not entirely standards. A pause, brittle and short. A formal review of my conduct in this role is underway. I expect it to take the rest of the term. I won't pretend that statement repairs anything. I wanted it said in this room, in front of him, instead of in a private memo where no one but me would ever have to hear it. She sat back down. It was not a redemption. Nobody in that room mistook it for one, including her. It was, at minimum, true, said out loud. In front of the people it should have been said to years earlier, and for the first time in living memory. Margaret Sinclair looked like a woman who had run out of ways to be the only one in the room who was never wrong. Dean Renner continued. Professor Hale has been removed from the Academic Standards Committee, effective today, pending a formal review of unauthorized access to student records in the course of building this complaint. That review may result in further action by the provost's office. She let that land, briefly, then turned, and for the first time that morning, smiled just slightly. There's one more piece of business. Mr. Calloway has asked to address the room. Isaiah walked to the front. He did not need the chalk this time. I'm not going to stand up here and give a speech about what it felt like to be doubted, he said. Most of you in this room have your own version of that story and don't need mine. I want to talk about one person instead. He found Odessa in the doorway, where she'd come to stand, still in her dining hall apron, because she'd come straight from her shift the second someone told her what was happening. My grandmother has worked in this university's dining hall for 31 years. She raised me. She left school in the 11th grade to go to work, and got her GED at 34 in a night class she never told a soul she was scared of. And every single year for 7 years, she asked me the same 6 words at her kitchen table. You still got that class, baby, and never once made it sound like a debt. He looked at her, and for a moment his voice was not the controlled, even thing it had been in every boardroom he'd ever stood in. I'm starting a scholarship today, through Variance Capital in her name. Full tuition, full need-based support, for first-generation students at this university, run through the same Promise program that paid for my books when I couldn't afford them. It's called the Isaiah Calloway Fund. It is the only thing I have ever built that I'm prouder of than the company. Odessa put her hand over her mouth in the doorway of a lecture hall she had walked past for 31 years on her way to feed other people's children, and a room full of students who, 3 weeks earlier, had no idea her name, stood up one by one and clapped for her until she had to look at the floor. Isaiah found her after, in the hallway, and didn't say anything at all. He didn't have to. She reached up the way she had 100 times when he was small enough for it to require reaching down instead, and put her hand against the side of his face. You finished the workbook, she said. I finished the workbook. Good, she said. Now go turn in your last assignment, baby, so I can stop hearing about it at my own dinner table. He laughed, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere lower than his chest, and walked her out to her car himself, and held the door, and watched her drive the 2 miles home to a house on Auburn Avenue that had been in the family longer than fair housing law, with the scholarship paperwork already moving through Variance Capital's foundation office before she'd even reached the first stoplight. He finished the class 3 weeks later. A B+, his lowest grade in years, which he found privately the funniest thing that had happened to him all spring. On a Sunday afternoon in May, he sat on Odessa's porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea sweating on the rail between them, and a manila envelope on his lap that had arrived from the registrar's office that morning. And he hadn't opened it yet, because some things you let sit in your hands for a minute before you let them be real. You gonna open that, Odessa said, or just hold it, like it's gonna bite you. He opened it, a single sheet of heavy paper, his name printed across it in a font that had not changed in probably 40 years, the word conferred, stamped in the corner with a date that had taken him 7 years, a stroke, $11,000, a federal filing, and one very long 9 days to reach. He turned it so she could see it. Isaiah Calloway looked at her grandson's diploma for a long moment, out on the porch where she'd told him, every year without fail, that he still had that class. And then she looked at him instead, because she'd already seen everything on that piece of paper that actually mattered, a long time before the university ever printed it down. She said, which from Isaiah Calloway on a good day was the whole sermon. Took you long enough. Yes, ma'am. Drink your tea, baby. It's getting warm. He drank his tea. The street was quiet, the particular quiet of a neighborhood that had earned the right to be quiet. And 3 blocks over, close enough to hear if the wind was right, a streetcar bell rang somewhere near Auburn Avenue, the same sound it had made every spring of his whole life. And Isaiah Calloway sat on his grandmother's porch with a diploma in his lap and a fund in her name already changing the math for somebody, somewhere on that campus this very semester, and understood, finally and all the way down, that he had not come back to Hargrove to prove anything to Margaret Sinclair or Gregory Hale at all. He had come back to keep a promise. Everything else had just been the proof. Okay. Before you scroll, let me be straight with you about what this story is and what it isn't. This is fiction. Isaiah isn't real. Odessa isn't real. Margaret Sinclair isn't real. Gregory Hale isn't real. Hargrove University isn't real, and neither is Variance Capital. Though if a fund with that name exists somewhere, I promise I didn't know about it. A few things in this story are real, though, and I put them in on purpose. The bias at the center of this one is real. There's a well-documented pattern in education research where low-income and first-generation students who suddenly perform above expectation get treated as suspects instead of as students who simply got room to grow. Researchers sometimes call the underlying mindset deficit thinking, the assumption that a kid from a struggling background has a ceiling, and that anything above it must be explained by something other than the kid. It shows up in classrooms more than anyone likes to admit. If you've ever watched someone's achievement get treated like evidence of wrongdoing instead of evidence of effort, you've seen this exact thing with your own eyes. The National Association of Mathematicians is also real. It was founded in 1969 by a group of black mathematicians who were tired of walking into national conferences and counting how few people in the room looked like them. It still exists. It still does the work of getting kids the mentorship and the rooms they were never automatically handed. Need-based scholarship programs like the fictional Hargrove Promise are modeled on real ones. If you're a first-generation or low-income student trying to figure out how to pay for a degree, programs like TRIO, Upward Bound, and QuestBridge are real. They're free, and they exist specifically to help. Look them up. They've changed more lives than most people realize. And Miss Odessa is real, too, even though her name in this story isn't. I mean that the way I mean it every time I write a character like her. I have stood in lines she served. I have been raised, in part, by women exactly like her. Women who left school early to go to work, who never once made their own sacrifice sound like a debt, who measured success in whether the people they loved finished what they started, not in whether anyone ever said thank you. If you work in a dining hall, a maintenance crew, a front desk, anywhere people walk past you on the way to somewhere else, I see you. So does this story. A word about Sinclair and Hale while I have you. People who write villains have a responsibility to remember villains are people too. Hale believed, genuinely, that he was protecting an institution's integrity. Sinclair believed for 30 years that cruelty and rigor were the same thing. Neither belief makes what they did okay. But I think it's worth sitting with the fact that bias rarely announces itself as bias. It usually shows up dressed as standards, as due diligence, as just doing my job. That's worth watching for in rooms you're actually in, not just in stories. One last thing. This story ends neat. A scholarship, a diploma, a porch, sweet tea. Real life is messier than that, and most fraud accusations don't get cleared by a single well-timed document. I wrote it this neat on purpose, because sometimes you need to watch the truth win clean, even in a made-up lecture hall on a made-up campus, on a street that only exists because I needed somewhere for a grandmother to sit. If something in this hit you, tell me in the comments. Tell me about your own Odessa. Tell me about the class you still haven't finished, the promise you're still keeping. I read what people write. I read all of it. Take care of each other out there. The world asks more of some people than it asks of others. The good ones finish the workbook anyway.